The room went quiet before anyone spoke my name, not the kind of quiet that brings relief. The kind that means a decision has already been made. I was standing there, hands still, listening as if listening could protect me. They spoke around me, not to me. A version of events was being repeated, confident, clean, rehearsed. It wasn't mine. I could hear the gaps where the truth should have been. No one asked me to fill them. I didn't argue. I didn't interrupt. I watched my parents nod as if certainty had weight. I watched my sister avoid my eyes. I understood then how easy it was to erase someone who stays calm. What followed took 5 years to arrive. No one saw it coming, especially them. Before everything broke, my life moved quietly. Not empty, just ordered. I woke up early, left the house before anyone else stirred, and returned at predictable hours. My parents liked that about me. They never said it directly, but I could feel it in the way they didn't ask questions. Stability mattered to them. I fit into that without effort. Our house ran on routines more than conversations. Dinner at the same time. The same seats at the table. The same questions asked out of habit, not curiosity. My father talked about work. My mother listened and corrected small details. I answered when spoken to. That was enough. My sister filled the space I didn't. She spoke easily, emotionally, with confidence. When she entered a room, attention shifted toward her without anyone deciding it should. My parents responded to her tone, her urgency, her expressions. I watched this dynamic form over years, slow and consistent. It never felt dangerous. It just felt like gravity. I trusted all of them. Not because they earned it every day, but because trust was assumed. Family meant continuity. It meant that even when things were uncomfortable, they would eventually realign. I believed that without thinking about it. I was the reliable one. If something needed to be handled quietly, it came to me. Paperwork, schedules, favors that didn't need acknowledgement. I learned early that being calm made life smoother for everyone else, so I stayed calm. My sister and I were close in a practical way. We shared space, history, routines. We didn't confide deeply, but there was no hostility. I never felt the need to guard myself around her. I assumed she knew who I was. I assumed that mattered. At home, no one questioned my character because no one thought about it. That felt like trust. I didn't realize it was also invisibility. When decisions were made, they happened around me. I adapted. I didn't push. That pattern was old. It had always worked. My parents often said they appreciated how easy I was. They said it like praise. I took it as confirmation that I was doing something right. Looking back, I can see how much of our family balance depended on silence. Not secrets, just things left unsaid because naming them felt unnecessary. We believed we knew each other well enough already. I didn't keep records then. I didn't notice dates or wording or tone shifts. I didn't feel the need to protect myself. Nothing in my experience suggested I would need to. There were small moments, conversations ending abruptly when I entered, looks exchanged that didn't include me, but I interpreted them generously. Everyone has private thoughts. Everyone needs space. I never imagined those moments were practice. My parents trusted my sister's voice more than my stillness. That wasn't a flaw to them. It was simply the way the family functioned. She articulated feelings. I absorbed them. Together, it seemed balanced. I believed that if something serious ever happened, they would come to me directly. That belief was quiet and firm. It shaped how I moved through the house, how I spoke, how I listened. I didn't prepare for conflict because conflict had never included me. When disagreements arose, they resolved without my involvement. I was the constant, not the variable. That was my normal world, predictable, calm, built on assumptions that had never been tested. Trust, I learned later, doesn't collapse loudly. Thins first, slowly, so slowly you mistake it for air. At the time, though, I didn't feel that thinning. I felt secure. I felt placed. I felt certain that whatever I didn't see couldn't matter, because if it did, someone would tell me. No one did. That silence felt like safety. The first change wasn't an event. It was a pause, a question that didn't get answered right away. A conversation that stopped when I entered the room, then restarted with different words. Nothing dramatic enough to challenge. Nothing clear enough to name. Just small hesitations that lingered longer than they should have. My sister started watching me more closely. Not openly, nothing confrontational, just brief looks that ended too quickly. I noticed because she had never done that before. She used to speak freely around me, complain, exaggerate, fill space. Now she measured it. I assumed it was stress. She was going through a lot at the time, or so my parents said. I accepted that explanation because it required no action from me. My parents changed in subtler ways. My mother's questions became practical instead of warm. My father listened longer before responding, like he was weighing something. When I spoke, they nodded, but their attention didn't fully settle. It drifted. There was one evening I remember clearly because nothing happened. We were all at the table. My sister mentioned a problem, something vague, unresolved. My mother immediately sided with her without asking details. My father followed. Their agreement felt rehearsed. I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't understand what role I was meant to play. No one asked for my input. No one checked my reaction. I wasn't excluded directly. I was simply unnecessary. After that, I started noticing patterns. My sister spoke to my parents privately more often. Doors closed, voices lowered. When I passed by, the conversations shifted to neutral topics. Weather, errands, nothing that invited questions. I told myself I was imagining it. Families go through phases. People talk differently when they're worried. I didn't want to be suspicious of people I trusted. There was a day my mother asked me a question that caught me off guard. It wasn't accusatory. It was careful. She asked where I had been the night before. I answered without hesitation. The truth was simple. Work. Home. Nothing unusual. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on me longer than necessary. Like she was checking something against a list I couldn't see. That was the first time I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear. Confusion. I didn't confront her. I didn't follow up. I assumed she had a reason that didn't involve me. After that, the questions continued. Small, framed as concern, always calm, always indirect. Each one felt like a test I didn't know I was taking. My sister avoided me more openly now. She was polite, distant. When our paths crossed, she kept conversations short. There was tension in her restraint, like she was holding back something heavy. I wondered if I had done something without realizing it. I replayed recent weeks in my head. Nothing stood out. No arguments, no secrets, no moments that could be misinterpreted, at least not by me. The discomfort stayed low-level, constant. It didn't spike. It didn't resolve. It just settled into the background of daily life. At night, I found myself listening more closely to sounds in the house. Footsteps, doors, voices. I wasn't searching for evidence. I was trying to understand what I had missed. When I spoke less, no one noticed. When I listened more, I noticed everything. There was a sense that decisions were being made somewhere else. Not about me, but involving me. I could feel it in the way my parents coordinated their responses. In the way my sister's mood shifted depending on who else was present. I considered asking directly. I even rehearsed the words once, standing alone in my room. They sounded reasonable, calm, non-threatening. I didn't say them. Something in me understood that asking too soon would change the shape of things, that whatever was forming needed space, that stepping into it without clarity would make me the problem. So I waited. I told myself that truth doesn't need urgency. That if there was something real, it would surface on its own. That trust, once established, doesn't disappear quietly. I was wrong about that last part, but at the time I still believed the discomfort was temporary, a misunderstanding waiting to resolve itself, a tension that would ease once everyone calmed down. I didn't know yet that calm was being used against me. The discomfort sharpened when patterns began repeating. It wasn't just the questions anymore. It was timing. The way certain conversations happened immediately after I left the house. The way my sister's mood shifted the moment my parents mentioned my name. These were not emotional reactions. They were adjustments. I started noticing inconsistencies, small ones at first. My sister would reference something I was supposedly involved in that I had never heard about. Nothing specific enough to accuse, just vague implications. A sentence left unfinished. A look exchanged across the room. Once my father mentioned a concern I didn't recognize. He phrased it carefully, like he didn't want to provoke defensiveness. I asked him to clarify. He said it wasn't important and moved on, but it had been important enough to say out loud. I began paying attention to language. Who said what? How often? My sister's story, whatever it was, never appeared fully formed. It arrived in fragments, always emotional, always urgent, always lacking detail. When I asked neutral questions, the room shifted. My mother's posture stiffened. My father grew quiet. My sister avoided answering directly. No one accused me of anything, but no one reassured me either. That silence felt deliberate. I noticed how often my parents said, "She wouldn't lie about something like this." They said it casually, as if no alternative had been presented, as if the statement itself was a boundary I wasn't meant to cross. I hadn't accused her. I hadn't denied anything. I hadn't even been told what this was. Still, the defense was already in place. I began to understand that something had been decided without my participation. Not concluded, shaped. A narrative forming slowly, reinforced through repetition rather than proof. There were moments when I caught my sister watching me with something close to relief, as if my silence confirmed something for her, as if my restraint was being interpreted as permission. That realization unsettled me more than any accusation would have. I checked my own behavior obsessively. My messages, my schedule, my interactions. I was looking for anything that could be misread, anything that could be weaponized. I found nothing. What frightened me wasn't the absence of evidence. It was the lack of interest in it. One afternoon, I overheard my parents talking. They didn't know I was home. My sister's name came up, then mine. The tone wasn't angry. It was cautious, strategic. My mother said, "We just need to be careful." Careful of what? She didn't say. When I entered the room, they stopped. My father smiled. My mother asked if I wanted tea. The conversation never resumed. That was when suspicion became unavoidable. I wasn't being confronted. I was being managed. I started noticing records, small ones, a bill that had been moved, a document photocopied unnecessarily. A calendar entry changed after I had seen it. These weren't incriminating. They were preparatory. Someone was organizing information, not to understand, but to protect. My sister's version of events shifted slightly depending on who she spoke to. I heard this through echoes, phrases repeated back to me by my parents that didn't match what she had said the day before. The changes were subtle enough to deny, but consistent enough to matter. I realized then that truth wasn't the goal. Stability was. And stability in this family meant believing the person who disrupted the peace the least. My sister's distress demanded response. My calm required none. I thought about speaking up forcefully, about asserting myself, but every instinct warned me that doing so would be reframed. Emotion would be seen as guilt, urgency as manipulation, so I stayed measured. That restraint, I would later understand, made everything easier for them. I began documenting quietly, not formally, just mentally. Dates, Statements, reactions. I didn't know what I would do with the information. I just knew I couldn't afford to forget it. The final red flag came without ceremony. My mother told me gently that my sister was going through something serious and needed support. She said it while looking at me, not accusing but not inviting questions either. I said I understood. She looked relieved. That relief told me everything. They had already chosen who to protect, and they believed I would accept it. At that moment, I understood the danger wasn't confrontation. It was erasure. The conversation finally happened without being announced. No one sat me down. No one asked if I was ready. It unfolded the way decisions in our house always did, quietly, as if the outcome had already been agreed upon somewhere else. My mother spoke first. Her voice was calm, careful. She said they were worried. She said there had been concerns for a while. She said my sister had been under a lot of pressure and had finally spoken up. I waited for the accusation. It never came directly. Instead, she described behaviors, patterns, feelings. She avoided specifics. Every sentence was shaped to sound reasonable, compassionate, unavoidable. My name wasn't attached to any action, but it hovered over the conversation like a conclusion everyone else had reached. I asked what she meant. My father answered this time. He said they didn't want to get into details. He said it would only make things worse. He said the important thing was acknowledging how much pain my sister was in. I said I didn't understand what I was being asked to acknowledge. That was when the tone shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. My mother said I was being defensive. My father said my reaction was concerning. They spoke as if my confusion was evidence of something else, something unspoken but implied. I stayed calm. I asked again what I had done. No one answered that question. My sister sat there quietly. She didn't look at me. When she spoke, it was softly, carefully. She said she didn't want to cause problems. She said she had struggled with whether to say anything at all. She said she had been scared. Scared of what she didn't say. My parents responded immediately. They reassured her. They thanked her for her honesty. They told her she was brave. No one asked why she was speaking now. No one asked why the details were missing. No one asked me anything beyond why I looked upset. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not anger. Wait, I said that if there was a concern, I wanted to address it directly. That hiding it didn't help anyone. My voice didn't rise. I chose my words carefully. My father shook his head. He said pushing for details was inappropriate. My mother said I needed to reflect instead of interrogate. Interrogate. That word stayed with me. I was told that my tone made people uncomfortable, that my insistence on clarity was aggressive, that my calmness felt calculated. Each observation reframed something neutral as suspicious. When I pointed out that no one had actually said what I was accused of, my mother sighed. She said that denial was common. That was the moment I understood there was no path through this conversation that led back to me being believed. Everything I said passed through a filter that distorted it. Silence meant guilt. Questions meant deflection. Calm meant manipulation. I stopped trying to correct them. They told me they needed space, that my presence was affecting my sister's recovery, that it would be best if I stayed elsewhere for a while. The decision was presented as temporary, compassionate, necessary. I asked how long. My father said they would see. I packed that night. No one helped. No one stopped me. My sister stayed in her room. My parents watched from the doorway as if supervision was required. There was no argument, no raised voices, just logistics. A week later, they cut off financial support. It was framed as boundaries. My mother said it was for everyone's well-being. My father said I needed to take responsibility. Responsibility for what no one clarified. I called once. My mother answered. She sounded tired. She said they hoped I was using this time to reflect. I said I wanted to talk about what had happened. She said now wasn't the right time. It never was. Friends asked why I had moved out so suddenly. I gave neutral answers. Work, independence, nothing dramatic. I didn't want the story repeated incorrectly. Inside the family, though, the story solidified without me. I heard fragments later, through relatives, through changes in tone. I was described as unstable, defensive, difficult. The absence of specifics made the narrative flexible. What hurt most wasn't the loss of support. It was how easily my parents accepted a version of me that required no evidence. They trusted my sister's fear more than my history, and because I didn't fight loudly, they mistook my restraint for confirmation. I didn't try to clear my name after that. I understood that engaging would only deepen the impression that something was wrong with me, so I stepped back. I let the distance harden. That was when I became officially unnecessary. Time changed the shape of the story, but not its center. 5 years passed without resolution, not because nothing happened, but because everything did quietly. Lives continued, careers advanced, new routines replaced old ones. The distance between me and my family became normal enough that no one questioned it anymore. I didn't chase explanations. I built a life that didn't require them. Work filled my days. Silence filled the rest. I learned how to exist without being interpreted. The truth didn't announce itself when it returned. It arrived indirectly, through systems that don't care about feelings. The first crack appeared in a document I wasn't supposed to see. A routine background check for work, nothing unusual. I skimmed it the way I always did, carefully, habitually. Then I noticed a reference that didn't belong, a date, a note, an institutional marker that aligned with the week everything had shifted. It wasn't an accusation. It was a record, neutral, unemotional, unaware of family dynamics. I requested clarification. The response was procedural. A misunderstanding, they said. Something reported informally, never substantiated. It had been flagged and later archived. No action taken. I asked who had reported it. They couldn't tell me. Privacy. That answer didn't frustrate me. It confirmed something instead. I began requesting records, not aggressively, not obsessively, just enough to understand the shape of what had been created. What existed now wasn't a lie in the way people imagine lies. It was a structure, a sequence of notes, a pattern of concern logged and left unresolved. There were witnesses, too, not people who took sides, but people who remembered inconsistencies. A counselor who recalled my sister's account changing slightly between sessions. A family acquaintance who remembered being asked to keep an eye on me without explanation. None of them contacted me directly. They didn't feel responsible. They assumed someone else had handled it. That was the quiet cruelty of it. Everyone deferred. No one verified. I never confronted my parents with what I found. I didn't see the point. The story they believed wasn't based on evidence. Evidence wouldn't dismantle it easily. What mattered was that the truth had survived somewhere outside the family. It existed in timestamps, in notes written by people who didn't know us, in files that didn't bend to emotion. I understood then that my erasure hadn't been complete. It had just been localized. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought distance. I stopped wondering whether I could have said something differently. The outcome hadn't depended on my words. It had depended on who spoke first. I heard updates about my family through others. My sister struggled. Jobs didn't last. Relationships ended abruptly. My parents supported her fully. They explained her instability as trauma. My name wasn't mentioned anymore. I had been absorbed into the cause, not the context. Then the call came, not from my parents, from a hospital. They asked if I was related to my sister. They used her full name. Their tone was professional, neutral. They said she had been admitted. They said there were complications. I told them who I was. There was a pause, not hesitation, processing. They asked if I could come in. I didn't ask why they were calling me now. I already knew. Some records only allow certain people access. Some histories don't matter in emergencies. Systems have their own logic. When I arrived, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no apologies waiting. My parents were there, older, exhausted. My mother looked surprised to see me. My father looked relieved. No one acknowledged the years between us. A doctor spoke in measured terms. Consent, history, context. There were gaps they needed filled. My sister was unconscious. Decisions were pending. I listened. I answered what I could. I didn't volunteer anything extra. In that sterile room with forms and monitors and quiet urgency, the past began surfacing without anyone trying to expose it. Records were requested. Timelines reviewed. Prior notes pulled automatically. No one argued. No one defended. The truth didn't need to accuse. It just needed to exist. I stood there, underestimated as always, watching systems do what families had refused to do. They were listening now. Not because they believed me, because procedure required it. The hospital didn't feel urgent in the way emergencies are usually described. There were no raised voices, no running, just a steady pressure that moved everything forward whether anyone was ready or not. My sister remained unconscious. Machines handled what she couldn't. Numbers blinked and adjusted without emotion. The doctors spoke carefully, choosing words that created distance between facts and responsibility. My parents sat close together as if proximity could substitute for certainty. They watched every movement from the staff, searching for reassurance that wasn't coming. When questions were asked, they answered quickly, too quickly. Their responses were shaped by habit, not verification. I noticed when their timelines hesitated, when they looked at each other before speaking. The staff noticed too. One of the doctors asked about medical history. My mother gave an answer that didn't align with what was on the screen. The doctor didn't correct her immediately. He just asked the question again differently. The second answer contradicted the first. No one reacted. The doctor made a note. That was how it escalated, not through confrontation but accumulation. They needed consent for a procedure. My parents assumed they would provide it. They had always done so. Authority in our family followed age and volume. But the nurse explained calmly that consent wasn't straightforward. There were prior directives. There were notes attached to my sister's file. There were limitations based on past statements. My parents didn't understand. They asked for clarification. The clarification required records. Records required review. As the system slowed things down, tension rose. My mother's composure thinned. She began explaining my sister's history emotionally instead of factually. She emphasized fear, trauma, vulnerability. She avoided dates. The staff listened politely, but their focus stayed on the screen. At one point, a social worker entered. She introduced herself and asked questions that didn't feel medical. Family dynamics, prior incidents, support systems. My parents answered as if reciting something familiar. They described my sister's struggles. They described their concern. They described distance carefully without naming me. The social worker asked about me anyway. She said my name clearly. No hesitation. My mother paused. My father cleared his throat. They said we were estranged. They didn't explain why. The social worker nodded and asked if there had been allegations in the past that affected family contact. The room went still. My parents looked at each other again, this time longer. My father said yes. The social worker asked whether those allegations had been substantiated. Silence answered first. Then my mother said it wasn't that simple. The social worker didn't argue. She just wrote something down. From that moment on, I was no longer invisible, not because anyone believed me, but because omission had become noticeable. The escalation continued quietly. More professionals entered, a psychologist, a senior physician. Each one reviewed the file independently. Each one asked similar questions in slightly different ways. The answers shifted each time. My sister's history, once treated as singular and unquestioned, began to fracture under repetition. I didn't speak unless asked. When I answered plainly. Dates, facts, what I knew, what I didn't, no emotion, no defense. That restraint changed the room. At some point, my mother looked at me differently, not with anger, with confusion, as if she was seeing a version of me that didn't fit the story she had been telling herself for years. My father avoided my eyes. The doctors explained that certain assumptions in my sister's file were being reassessed, that some notes lacked corroboration. That decisions made earlier might have been influenced by incomplete information. They didn't say wrong, they said incomplete. My parents heard accusation anyway. My mother tried to intervene. She reminded them of her daughter's suffering, of how hard everything had been, of how difficult it was to speak up. The senior physician listened patiently. Then he said something simple. He said their role wasn't to validate narratives. It was to assess risk. Risk didn't care who spoke first. Risk responded to patterns. I watched my parents realize they no longer controlled the frame. Their authority had worked in the house. It didn't work here. When the consent issue returned, it came with conditions. Additional review, temporary delays, oversight. My parents protested softly, not angrily, as if politeness could restore certainty. It didn't. The escalation reached its peak not with a decision, but with a realization. The truth my sister had built her protection on was being examined by people who had no emotional investment in it, and it wasn't holding its shape. I stood there, quietly present, knowing that whatever happened next would happen without my intervention. For the first time in years, that felt like power. Not because I controlled anything, because I didn't need to. The breaking point didn't arrive as a decision. It arrived as clarity. I was sitting alone in the waiting area when it settled in. The hospital lights hummed softly. A television played something no one was watching. Everything felt suspended, like the building itself was holding its breath. I realized then that I could step away. No one had asked me to stay. My involvement wasn't legally required. I could leave the hospital and return to the distance I had built so carefully. The systems would continue without me. The reviews, the delays, the reassessments, they didn't need my presence. That option felt real, possible, clean. And yet I didn't stand up. What stopped me wasn't loyalty. That had already been dismantled years ago. It wasn't hope for reconciliation. I had learned not to expect that. It was responsibility. Not the kind my parents had accused me of lacking, but the kind no one else could absorb. I understood what my silence would cost now. If I left, the truth would still exist in fragments. Records would note inconsistencies. Professionals would flag concerns. But without context, those fragments would remain inconclusive. My sister's narrative would survive, damaged, but intact enough to continue shaping outcomes. If I stayed, I would become part of the record, not as an accuser, as a constant. That realization carried weight, because becoming part of the record meant accepting that my life would always be adjacent to this story, that no amount of distance could fully erase my involvement. I thought about the years I had spent rebuilding. The discipline it had taken to remain composed when people spoke about family as if it were permanent and safe. I had learned how to live without correction. Staying meant reopening something I had sealed deliberately. When the social worker returned, she asked if I was willing to answer more questions. She framed it as optional. She respected the word. I said yes. We sat in a small room, neutral walls, neutral tone. She asked about timelines, about communication. about when contact had stopped and why. I answered carefully. I didn't dramatize, I didn't minimize. I described what had happened as it had felt, confusing, indirect, unresolved. She asked how I had responded at the time. I told her the truth, that I had stayed calm, that I had left when asked, that I had not pursued confrontation. She paused at that. Not judgment, consideration. She asked why. I thought before answering. I said that I understood early on that anything I did emotionally would be interpreted through suspicion. That restraint felt safer for everyone. She nodded slowly. That nod mattered more than I expected. Later, a doctor asked if I would be willing to serve as a temporary decision support contact if needed. Not authority, not control, just availability. My parents were present for that conversation. My mother's face tightened. My father said nothing. The request wasn't accusatory. It was procedural, based on current assessments, based on gaps that needed coverage. I said I would be available. Not because I wanted to be, because refusing would confirm the version of me they had believed all along. That was the breaking point. I accepted that there was no outcome where I emerged untouched. No choice that preserved both my boundaries and my integrity completely. Helping would cost me emotionally. Refusing would cost me morally. I chose the cost I could live with. That night, I sat beside my sister's bed while machines worked steadily. She looked smaller than I remembered. Vulnerable in a way that felt real, not performed. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. I thought about how easily fear had replaced evidence, how quickly concern had become certainty, how little my history had mattered once doubt was introduced. I understood then that this wasn't about proving anything. It was about allowing the truth to exist where it couldn't be reshaped. I didn't speak to my sister. I didn't need to. The room was already full of information she couldn't control. When I left for the night, my parents were still there. My mother looked like she wanted to say something. She didn't. Silence had become our shared language, but this time it wasn't erasing me. It was documenting everything. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as procedure. By morning, the tone in the hospital had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to feel it. Conversations happened with doors half closed. Staff spoke more deliberately. Files were opened more often than they were closed. My sister was stable, but her case had grown heavier. What had once been treated as straightforward now required justification. Every decision was reviewed, every assumption rechecked. My parents noticed immediately. My mother asked why things were taking so long. A nurse explained that additional assessments were in progress. My father asked who had requested them. The answer was neutral. Based on the file. That phrase repeated throughout the day. The file had changed, not in content, but in interpretation. Notes once treated as foundational were now contextual. Emotional language had been separated from factual markers. Dates were aligned. Gaps stood out clearly once no one tried to smooth them over. A physician explained that some earlier conclusions about my sister's condition were being reconsidered. That certain interventions had been chosen based on perceived risk factors that no longer appeared consistent. My mother argued softly. She reminded them of what my sister had said, of how frightened she had been, of how hard it was to speak up. The physician listened. Then he said something simple. Fear is relevant, but it is not evidence. No one contradicted him. Later, a formal review was initiated. Not an investigation, just a verification process. That distinction mattered. It meant the system wasn't accusing anyone. It was correcting itself. Consent forms were updated. Oversight was added. Decision-making authority was redistributed according to policy, not assumption. My parents were no longer the final reference point. That loss unsettled them more than any direct accusation would have. I watched my father read a document twice, then set it down carefully, as if it might break. My mother asked whether this meant someone had done something wrong. The administrator answered honestly. It meant that conclusions had been reached without sufficient corroboration. That word, corroboration, hung between us. No one asked me how it felt. No one needed to. My role had already been absorbed into the process. My statements were now part of the record, cross-referenced and time-stamped. I hadn't proven anything. I had simply stayed. The most difficult moment came unexpectedly. A nurse approached me privately and asked about contact preferences going forward. She explained that given the reassessment, they needed to know who should be consulted and when. My parents were standing nearby. They could hear every word. I answered calmly. I said my availability was limited. That communication should be scheduled. That boundaries mattered. The nurse nodded and wrote it down. That, more than any document, shifted the dynamic. My parents saw then that I wasn't there to reclaim anything. I wasn't seeking authority or apology. I was cooperating on my terms. The realization unsettled them. That evening, my sister regained consciousness briefly. She was disoriented, weak. My mother leaned in immediately, offering reassurance. My father stood back, uncertain. When my sister's eyes found mine, there was recognition and something else, not relief, calculation. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The context had changed. The room no longer belonged to her version alone. In the following days, outcomes unfolded quietly. Care plans were adjusted. Notes were amended. Language was softened where it had once been absolute. No one confronted my sister. No one accused my parents. The consequence was subtler than that. Their certainty dissolved. They could no longer say, "We know what happened." They could only say, "This is what was believed." That distinction mattered everywhere else. At home, it had never existed. When discharge planning began, I was included automatically. Not as a hero, as a data point. My parents watched that happen without comment. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt closure forming not through acknowledgement but through limitation. The lie hadn't been exposed publicly. It had been contained. And for the first time in years, it could no longer shape my life. I left the hospital before sunrise. There was nothing left for me to contribute. The plans were in place. The file was complete. My presence no longer changed the outcome. My parents were still there when I went. My mother sat upright, hands folded, staring at a wall that offered no answers. My father stood by the window, watching the parking lot like he was trying to remember how he had arrived at this point. No one stopped me. That felt appropriate. Outside, the air was cold and steady, the kind of cold that clears your head without demanding anything from you. I stood for a moment and listened to the building behind me, doors opening, alarms softening, systems continuing. Inside, my sister would recover, not quickly, not easily. Her life would move forward with new limits and quieter oversight. The story that had protected her for years would no longer work the same way. My parents would adjust. They would never say they were wrong. They would say they had done their best with what they knew. They would grieve a certainty they could not recover. I didn't need more than that. I walked to my car without looking back, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because the past had already finished unfolding. There was no victory waiting for me, no apology scene, no recognition that restored what had been taken. What I had now was narrower and heavier. The truth existed. It existed in places that mattered, on paper, in timestamps, in quiet acknowledgments that would never be spoken aloud. It no longer required my defense. For years, I had been defined by what wasn't said, by the space my silence allowed others to fill. Now, that silence had a different weight. It marked the end of something I had carried alone. I started the engine and drove away, not relieved, not triumphant, just finished. And for the first time since the day I was quietly erased, that was enough.